Welcome to this presentation on delayed authentication, preventing replay and relay attacks in private contact tracing. My name is Krzysztof Pietrzak and I'm at IST Austria. So this talk is about contact tracing, which is a term from public health, where the general idea is to curb the spread of a contagious disease by identifying the contacts of infected people and make sure that they don't spread the disease any further. Now, traditionally, this has been done by simply interviewing diagnosed people and ask them who they met, and then try to contact and warn those contacts. More recently, something called digital contact tracing came up, and basically the idea is to leverage the fact that nowadays most people run around with the mobile phone all days and kind of somehow use that for contact tracing. And the by far most popular instantiation of this approach is to basically have some app that is installed on the phone of participants. Then this app would constantly record and announce itself to other apps so that later, if a person is identified, all persons with which this person came in contact and that also have this app can be alerted. There are many different aspects of such contact tracing apps that have been extensively discussed in the scientific and literature and popular news. For example, one is efficiency and simplicity. You really don't want the app to kind of drain your battery, or you don't want to kind of your videos to stall just because the app is running in the background. Another very important fact is, very important aspect is privacy. Ultimately, we want users to use this app voluntarily, so it's very important that they don't feel that they're giving away more privacy than is really necessary for this task. And there are other discussions going on, for example, utility. Should the app really just record contacts, or also kind of more information that could, for example, allow to find hotspots or things like that. And in this talk, I want to address an aspect that I think has been not sufficiently addressed so far in the literature, namely the security of such contact tracing apps. And when we talk about security, it's kind of not a priori clear what it even means for a contact tracing app to be secure or robust. But I think the two basic failures that one can identify for such an app are false positives and false negatives. Now, false positive simply means that a person is alerted even though that person was not in proximity or in contact with the person that has later been diagnosed. Of course, it cannot mean that the person gets alerted even though that person is not actually infected or sick. This is not something that the app can do. And in the same way, a false negative simply means that the person doesn't get alerted even though they were in proximity with the sick person. So false negatives can have many reasons. There could be a malicious denial of service attack that prevents the app from recording these connections. There could be all kinds of communication failures, bugs in the implementation, wrong parameter settings. Maybe your battery is empty. But false positives seem to be kind of the more urgent and more important aspect to address. Now, on a small scale, false positives seem very generic and easy to launch on any contact tracing apps. For example, I could always borrow the phone from somebody, run with this app around in the city, and then bring this phone back. And when that person gets diagnosed, then everyone I met will actually get an alert. What is more important is to prevent such false positives on a very large scale. And in the literature, basically two attacks have been identified which can be used to create such false positives on a very large scales against the current apps that are used. One is replay and relay attacks, and this is actually the topic of this presentation. And the other one are Inverse-Sybil attacks, which I will mention very shortly at the end of this talk. Now, the by far most popular digital contact tracing app out there is the Google Apple Exposure Notification API. So it's basically a system that is running on every iOS or Android phone, and on top of which one can implement such contact tracing apps. The protocol itself is based on previous academic protocols, particularly DP3T from Europe and COVID-Watch from the US. The protocol itself is almost extremely simple. It just works as follows. So if the app is installed, it will basically generate a temporary exposure key K, this key K here, once a day. From this key, roughly every 15 minutes, a fresh identifier is created. And this identifier is then constantly broadcast during those 15 minutes. At the same time, every app constantly records all identifiers it receives. So for example, in this case, Miss Piggy here would record this identifier here that she received from Kermit. And I will actually explicitly put these values that parties have to constantly store on their phone into such pink boxes like here, because this will be useful for later. Okay, now if Kermit gets diagnosed, so he goes to the doctor, then he gets kind of a permission to upload his exposure keys to a backend server, and regular users will, say once a day, download all the uploaded keys. They will derive all the identifiers from those keys and then check if any of the derived identifiers matches what they have locally stored on their phone. And if there is a match, they will panic. Now, of course, in practice, this is more difficult. If there is an alert, it will depend on things like the signal strength and the duration of the exposure and so on. But for this talk, this is an orthogonal problem that is not relevant for this presentation. Okay, so what are replay and relay attacks? Now assume actually Kermit meets Cookie Monster here, who is like a malicious guy. He receives this identifier from Kermit, and maybe at a later time point and at a totally different location, he simply replays the identifiers he has received and stored from other parties. So Gonzo would get this identifier here. Why is this a problem? If Kermit gets diagnosed and uploads his key, Gonzo will think he has been in contact with an infected person, even though that's not the case. A very similar attack are relay attacks. It's basically a replay attack in real time. So here we have like not just one attacker, but you can think of them as two attackers. And Cookie Monster here will in real time relay the messages to Lord Count. And again, Gonzo will think he was infected. So for this protocol, relay and replay attacks are basically it doesn't really matter, but we will see later that for, once we start hardening the protocols, there will be actually a difference between this real-time relay attack or a replay attack that actually just replays things later in time. One of the early works that actually tried to harden these existing protocols against replay attacks is Vaudenay's papers. It's an eprint as shown in the link above. So his idea is very simple and inspired by symmetric identification protocols. So the protocol basically starts off as the protocol I just showed you, where maybe with one minor difference. From the daily key, we not only derive an identifier, but also like a key little k, which is a key for a symmetric authentication scheme. Otherwise, everything is the same. But now if Miss Piggy receives an identifier, the protocol continues. She samples a random challenge string, say, a 100-bit random challenge string. She sends that string, that challenge back to the sender of the ID. And then Kermit here will have to compute the message authentication code or authenticate the ID and the challenge using this key k he derived from his daily key. And this authentication tag he will send back to Miss Piggy, who will kind of store this identifier challenge tag triple. Now, if Kermit gets diagnosed, everything as before, he uploads the key, Miss Piggy gets the key, she derives the identifier, and if it matches, she doesn't panic quite yet. She does one more check. She also takes the key k, little k that she derived from the daily key, and she actually checks if the tag matches. So if the tag is indeed an authentication of the ID and the challenge under this k little k, and only if this is also the case, she will kind of start panicking. How does this protocol prevent replay attacks? Anticipate an adversary, Cookie Monster again here, who interacted with Kermit. So he has stored this, he received this triple ID challenge tag here. And at a later time point, he might want to replay this ID. So he replays this ID to Gonzo here. But Gonzo will pick a totally fresh challenge star. And this challenge will almost certainly be different from the challenge that the Cookie Monster chose before. So in order to kind of really make Gonzo trigger an alert, should Kermit later be diagnosed, he would have to forge a message authentication tag. But if this is IIS or something, we believe this is computationally infeasible. So this protocol that I showed you, okay, it solves replay attacks, but it has one big disadvantage, namely this interaction. So these Google Apple API protocols for communication, they in particular use something that is called low energy Bluetooth. This is a interface that does not even allow for sessions. And for various other reasons, we really do not want to have this interaction. And we would like to stick with this extremely simple template where advertising app simply broadcasts some value that is then stored by other apps. Here's a very simple idea how to make this protocol from before non-interactive. So note that the only message that actually goes in the wrong direction, namely from Miss Piggy to Kermit, is this challenge. Now, what we could do is we, for example, could replace this challenge simply with the current time. This is something that both parties know and just can locally derive. Let's say the current time rounded to a second. And now the protocol is as before, but they simply use the time t instead of the challenge. So Kermit would kind of compute a tag, and he would authenticate the current time and send this tag over to Miss Piggy, who would then store the identifier, the time, and the tag. And later she would verify that indeed that tag is a MAC of t should Kermit get diagnosed. And it's not hard to see that this actually also prevents replay attacks, because if one would want, let's say Miss Piggy would want to replay that identifier at the later time point, she would basically have to forge a tag for a time t plus delta, where delta is the time since she met Kermit. And again, this would basically boil down to forging the message authentication code. There is one big problem with this approach, namely, if we look what parties store now, we see that Miss Piggy actually has to store not only information that reveals that she met Kermit, which is unavoidable, but she also has to store information, or she stores information when that encounter happened. And from a privacy perspective, this is really problematic. People might not want to do that. It's actually what the Google Apple API does to some extent. So this is a layout of the scheme. So this up here is the daily key. Using some hash key derivation function, we derive some key, which is then used to authenticate the time. It's some en interval number, which is basically a value that rotates every 15 minutes. And from this, we then derive this identifier. And then there is also some metadata. This is the stuff on the right. Now, this means that basically they use this idea with the time on a granularity of 15 minutes. This has the disadvantage that, of course, replay attacks are still possible in a 15 minutes window. And from a privacy perspective, it's still a problem. I mean, you can, if you confiscate the phones of users, you can figure out when they met up to a granularity of 15 minutes. So far, I only talked about replay attacks. What about relay attacks? So this scheme is, of course, not secure against relay attacks. If the message is, if Ms. Piggy is malicious and she relays the message to somebody at a totally different location in real time, that person will have the same time and will be ultimately convinced that he talked with Kermit, should Kermit get diagnosed. But it's actually easy to extend this protocol to also take into account other coordinates rather than time. For example, they could additionally authenticate their location, not just their time. Location could, for example, mean the cell towers IDs they see, or maybe some coarse-grained GPS coordinates, coarse-grained like a 50 times 50 meter grid, just to make sure that people who are physically close actually will be in the same grid point. But of course, this would require the app to also use GPS or other interfaces. Now, a natural question is, so can we have both? Can we have a privacy-preserving protocol that does not reveal our time or even location while still being non-interactive? And indeed, there is a very simple solution that uses somewhat heavier crypto, heavier than the symmetric key crypto that is used in the original scheme, namely digital signatures. Here's the protocol. It's very simple. Now, the advertising app, so Kermit here, would simply derive a public secret key pair for a digital signature scheme. And then he would sign the current time using the secret key. What he would send, what he would broadcast is the public key together with the signature. And Miss Piggy would basically just store the public key. After doing one check, so she would actually check that the signature sigma here really is a signature of the current time that she locally received under that public key. And should Kermit get later diagnosed, Miss Piggy will get his key, she will derive this public key, and if there is a match, then she will be alerted. And again, public keys are usually big enough so that they can, always big enough so that they can actually serve as unique identifiers here. And the nice property of this protocol is, of course, now if we look at what values are stored, they are kind of totally independent of the time when Miss Piggy and Kermit met, right? We see that they met because this public key was derived from the key that Kermit stores, which is necessary, but nothing beyond that. But it uses public key crypto, which is arguably quite a bit heavier than the hashing or maybe IIS used in the current protocol. So the question we looked at is if we can have a protocol like that, privacy preserving and non-interactive, just using simple symmetric key cryptographic scheme. Let's say just hashing, for example. And indeed, so I will show you such a protocol now. It's we termed it delayed authentications for reasons that we come to later. So we start again with the protocol from before. So this is the non-interactive protocol that reveals the time. So Ms. Piggy has to store the time here. And the basic idea is to now use a statistically hiding commitment scheme. So let me remind you, statistically hiding commitment scheme is a function. It takes as input a message, some randomness R, and it outputs a commitment, and it has two security properties. The first is hiding. So for any two messages, M and prime, if we compute the commitment with some fresh randomness, the distribution of that commitment will be statistically close in both cases. So the commitment information theoretically hides the message that is committed. The other property is the computational binding property, which basically asks you that it should be computationally hard or infeasible to find any tuples, any message randomness tuples where the messages are different that would result in the same commitment. What Kermit now does is he basically, instead of authenticating, computing a message authentication code of the time, he first computes a signature, he first computes a commitment of the time. So he samples some randomness rho and computes this commitment sigma of the current time. And then he authenticates this commitment. What he sends over to Ms. Piggy is, as before, the ID and this tag, and additionally the randomness he used to compute the commitment. Ms. Piggy will recompute the commitment, and what she would store is the identifier, the tag, and the commitment. Why should this be secure? So it's not hard to see that a successful replay attack would actually require an attacker to either break the message authentication code as before, or in this case, it's additionally sufficient to break the binding property of the commitment scheme. But now, unlike before, this protocol is much more private in the sense that the values jointly stored by Kermit and Ms. Piggy do not reveal the time when they actually met, because Ms. Piggy just stores a computationally statistically hiding commitment of the time and not the time itself. And even though this protocol is very simple, it might be a little bit unintuitive for cryptographers in the sense that we usually use commitments to commit to a message that we have now, and later we reveal the randomness to show what was contained in that commitment. Here it's kind of the opposite. Here we actually have a message where everyone knows, both parties know the message. And so we send over this commitment. And the idea is that later we can actually forget about the message and still be sure that we authenticated the same thing, the correct thing, even though the key required to verify the MAC key is only revealed at a later time point. So in the paper, actually a new primitive is defined. So what I showed you before is looks a bit like a hack, but in fact you can simply see this protocol before as the original protocol, but where we use something that we term a delayed message authentication code. And it's, in a nutshell, it's basically normal message authentication code. But now the verification of an authentication tag has two steps, not just one as usually, but the two steps have different functionality. So the first step, this verification one, only takes as input the message and the tag, but not any secret key. And it outputs something that is statistically independent of the message. And then there is a second step that only takes the secret key and this input that is now independent of the message and verifies. In particular, the construction I showed before would result in such a delayed message authentication code, using a standard message authentication code in combination with the statistically hiding commitment, as shown on the bottom. Okay. So now in the Google Apple API, this Google Apple API uses something that is called low energy Bluetooth. As I mentioned before, this is basically a scaled down version of Bluetooth that has no sessions. And basically what it can do is just broadcast beacons. And the beacons that are broadcast are 31 bytes. And the Google Apple API basically uses 16 of those 31 bytes for this identifier. And the rest is reserved for other stuff, in particular some metadata and headers and so on. So the question is, can we just use this protocol that I just showed you now, this delayed authentication protocol, as a fall-in replacement to strengthen the security of this Google Apple API against replay attacks without really changing the protocol much, which would basically require to kind of fit the message that we need to broadcast, which is not just an identifier, but an identifier, a tag, and this message row into 128 bits. And a priori, this seems kind of totally impossible to do if you want any kind of meaningful security guarantees. In particular, how would we compute the commitment in practice? We would simply use a hash function, and to commit the message M with the randomness row, we would simply concatenate the message and the randomness, apply a hash function and truncate it at L bits. Now, it's well known that if we want statistical hiding, the randomness should be at least as long as the output. So this row should be at least L. Moreover, to get computationally binding requires the hash function H to be collision resistant. And finally, we know that to achieve, because of birthday attacks, we know to achieve collision resistance with n-bit security, so security against adversaries who run in time up to 2 to the n, requires an output length that is in the ballpark of at least 2 times n. So in particular, with 128 bits, so if L is 128 bits, we cannot even hope to get any security better than 64. And even for the 64 security, we would use up the entire tag just for the randomness, and there is still a tag that we have to fit in and then identify. There's one simple observation is actually that for this particular protocol, for a successful replay attack, it's not sufficient to just find collisions, because what happens is the honest sender, Kermit in this case, he chooses the randomness row. And then given this randomness row in the identifier and the current time, the adversary has to find now another, for another time t prime, he has to find another randomness row prime that will commit to the same value. And this translates to a new requirement to the hash function. We don't need the hash function to be collision resistant. It's in fact sufficient if it's only second pre-image resistant. And it's known that for second pre-image resistance, it's in fact sufficient that it's sufficient to have to get n bits of security. It's sufficient to have an output length of slightly more than n. So in particular, in our protocol, we set the randomness to be 80 bits, and we will get basically 80 bits of security for the commitment scheme. Now there is also this tag and this ID. We set the tag to 35 bits and the identifier to 10 bits. And we claim that this actually gives very good practical cryptographic security for the scheme. And I will not go into the details, but you can look them up in the paper. So we claim it's indeed possible to squeeze those tags into 128 bits and get very meaningful security guarantees. Okay, so I promised you at the beginning that I will also mention a few words about the other attack that allows for large-scale false positives. And this attack is termed Inverse-Sybil attack. And it roughly works as follows. So assume you have like a group, here I just showed 3, but think 1,000 of malicious parties. Either these are malicious parties, this could also be honest users whose phone simply got hacked. And what they do is they all instantiate their phones with the same initial keys. What happens then is, those 1,000 people roam through the city and all of them use the same identifiers because they have the same initial keys to broadcast. So we have 1,000 people broadcasting the same identifiers. And if later one of them gets diagnosed and is allowed to upload his key, not only his contacts would be alerted, but anyone who was in proximity to any one of those 3 people shown here will also get an alert. So I think it's a very simple attack to launch a very large-scale false positives, and it's substantially harder to prevent this attack, it seems, than replay attacks. And if you want to know more about it and maybe some initial ideas how to do it, below here is a link to a recent eprint paper. Okay, thank you for attending the talk.